This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. And we will go ahead and move along with our moment of silence. And this is in memory of the work that we are doing in the victims of the race massacre, and just to be cognizant of basically their memories. And I just want to say again, thank you to everyone for the hard work that is being done and has been done to date. Can you join me in a moment, please? Thank you so very much. As Amy said, we will be having basically a presentation by our Public Physical Investigation Committee. And Phoebe, if you'd like to go ahead and start out with that.
No, I'll have to pass to Carrie. She got.
Okay, well, we'll pass to Carrie. Carrie?
Won the fight. So Carrie will go first and I'll go second.
All righty. Thank you.
So Amy, am I going to do the power? You say, okay, you've got the PowerPoint. Awesome. So good evening, everybody. It's nice to see everybody's faces, and thank you for joining us here this evening. So this evening, we're going to spend a little bit of time just kind of recapping, really focusing principally on the recent investigations that we completed at the Oaklawn Cemetery, specifically in the original 18 area. We had just circulated an executive summary document that actually covered all of the areas that we looked at in Oaklawn Cemetery in 2020. But for the purposes of tonight's discussion, we anticipated that people would probably prefer to focus on the location where we actually did find evidence of a mass grave. Next slide, please. So indeed, we were successful at revealing evidence of a mass grave in the original 18 area at Oaklawn. We had the combined area that we exposed through our test excavations was some 27 square meters, or about 290 square feet. As a result of the investigations that we completed, we do believe that there is we found indications that the mass grave could encompass a larger area than what we actually exposed through the excavations. That could measure about 131 square meters, or just over 1,400 square feet. The data that we're drawing from most heavily to develop the argument for the boundaries, the approximate boundaries of that mass grave, stem largely from our auger data from the soil cores that we extracted. So basically, when we were in the process of excavation, and when we identified the very first burial, where you'll see number 1, kind of towards the right side of your screen there, we were able to observe what the soils looked like in the several feet of overburden that were over that individual. And we did not see what we would otherwise normally find as evidence of a singular grave shaft. So typically, when you are burying one individual, you will create a hole that is supposed to be just big enough to fit that individual's coffin. It's going to be slightly larger than that coffin, but not very much bigger, right? From an archaeological perspective, when we come in later and if we excavate that individual, typically we will see indications of disturbed soil for that single grave shaft, and the soil within that area is going to look distinctive compared to the soil around it. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying we're looking for, like, we look for indications of a single grave shaft. But we did not find that evidence as we were coming down onto and then ultimately discovered the first individual that was exposed in our excavation process. And indeed, the area that we saw for the soil that had been disturbed in that overlying, that overburden, was much larger than would have been necessary to accommodate a single individual. So with that, we started to ponder the possibility that we may be actually looking at at something different here. And so we decided to go on ahead and pause with our excavations for the moment in terms of our backhoe work. And we shifted to conducting auger tests in the surrounding area, both to the north, south, and west of Burial 1, to see if we could get a handle on the spatial extent of where we were seeing that disturbed soil that we considered to be possible grave shaft fill. With that, we were able to, so that was basically the red dots that you see that correlate to that yellow line are the locations where we found that evidence of soils that matched what we were seeing with the overburden that was over individual 1 in Burial 1. Those red dots that are outside of that area did not have the same stratigraphic signatures, did not have the same indications of that disturbed soil. So we considered those to be outside of our area of interest. Further, and there's one that's not marked on here, but there was an auger that Dr. Deborah Green conducted that was horizontal. So it actually started from the northwest wall of that block where number 1 is and went to the north. And what was very interesting about that was she was able to then track the consistency of those disturbed soils up until the point at which it reached that yellow line, right? And it was very distinctive, and there was a very abrupt boundary beyond that point where she was getting into soils that were very different, that we knew that were different and more distinctive compared to what was inside that area. And that location matched very nicely with that dot that you see there, that auger probe that was just to the west. So with that, we felt very, very comfortable, basically, that what we were looking at was not just a singular grave associated with that burial number 1. We began to ponder the possibility that we may be actually looking at a possible mass grave. So with that, we then shifted to, instead of doing, our initial effort was focused on just exposing individual burials or expectations of individual burials based on the historic data. And Phoebe's going to talk a little bit about that some more later. But instead of just doing them one by one, which is how we thought they were actually interred within this area, we actually decided to expose a larger trench to the west of Burial 1 to determine if we could actually track those soils out and if it was consistent across that whole area, or if it had interruptions, or just basically to get a sense of what was going on. And indeed, what we ended up finding with that trench was that those disturbed soils did continue on to the west, and it lined up really nicely with that auger probe that you see just to the north of the west end of the trench. And that we had a very nice boundary on that end. But furthermore, and more importantly, we exposed the coffins of several individuals. So we had the burial number 1, and then we actually ended up exposing an additional 11 and possibly more coffins in that trench, that excavation trench, backhoe trench. Next slide, please. So in total, at least 12 individuals are located within this area. This is based largely on evidence for coffins and coffin hardware. That very first individual that we encountered was an adult, very likely a female, and Phoebe's again going to speak about that, I think, more with her slides. But the skeletal remains were not in a very good state of preservation. We were concerned then that we didn't want to expose further remains and potentially do damage to them before we have an opportunity to actually complete the specialized analyses that really need to occur with these remains, so that we can We can do all of the different things in terms of potentially identifying these individuals or doing the assessment of the demographics and so forth. And so we really did not want to do any harm at this stage in the investigation. So once we knew that the remains were potentially not going to be in a very good state of preservation, we determined that it was probably going to be most optimal to simply expose the coffins, but do our best to not actually expose the remains themselves and leave that for a future date when we would potentially return to conduct additional investigations in the actual exhumation process. So for that reason, what you end up seeing, if you look in that trench, the photograph of the trench in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, so you're not seeing any remains there, but that's where we were basically exposing. We came down just on the top part of the coffins and then stopped excavation and then proceeded on further to the west and did that in a stepwise fashion until we got outside of the trench. And in that process, that was where we exposed those additional 11 coffins. In some cases, so these are wooden coffins, and so in some cases, we actually had some nice outlines of the coffin based on the wood that itself is somewhat fragmentary. But in some cases, we didn't have the wood, rather we actually had hardware. So you have nails that were at the points that would have otherwise been the corners of those coffins. Even if we didn't have a really good indication, solid indication of the coffin itself, the nails, we have nails in the locations where they should be for that coffin to hold it together. We also have other types of coffin hardware, such as coffin handles, like you see Mayor Bynum. That's one example that he's holding in his hand right there. And then we also have that metal plate. This was in the middle of the screen. It reads "at rest," and this was discovered with burial number 1. And so these are, when we're talking about coffin hardware, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And so those were some of the cues or the clues that we use to help us assess the burials that were exposed in Backhoe Trench A. So given the amount of size or the size of the area that we exposed through the test excavations, we can approximate if our assessment of those possible boundaries of the mass grave are accurate, and provided that we see a continuing pattern in terms of how people are laid out, how coffins are laid out in the rest of that area. We can then develop an estimate for planning purposes that we could be looking at perhaps more than 30 individuals interred within this mass grave. And I would caution, though, this is basically a working hypothesis from our perspective. It is a possibility, but it is something that we will have to go through the process of actually confirming this through the next phases of the investigation and actually confirming it through the excavation process to actually confirm if our current assessment holds true. So again, with the exception of burial number 1, we did not intentionally expose any additional human remains and did our best to try and leave those in place to the extent possible. But again, additional investigations are going to be needed to provide confirmation. Next slide, please. And this provides a nice plan view map. So that upper map is, so we call that plan view. So it's as if you are looking down on top from above that excavation trench. And you can see how we have drawn in the approximate indicators of the boundaries or the outlines of those coffins and the associated numbers. So we had 12 that we felt quite confident about, and I would say at least one of these individuals may actually may have been maybe intrusive, and that means that individual may have been buried actually quite a bit later than the mass grave event, and was not actually part of that event. But so once, we'll have to do again, our further excavations would actually give us some more detailed information on this. But we also have, you'll see there are 3 additional kind of dotted lines for number 13, 14, and 15. So those are individuals for whom it's not great. We did not have the same kind of exposure of the coffins for those as we did with the others. But from our observations of the soils, presence of decayed wood, the handle there by number 13, those for us are all indications that we feel like there's a pretty good possibility that we would encounter additional coffins as we continue to excavate deeper in those particular locations. I would also like to highlight one additional interesting feature that was discovered through the excavation process. And on the left-hand side of the screen for both the plan view and then with that profile view, the north wall profile that you'll see underneath. So this is as if you are inside the trench and you are looking at the north wall of the trench. We mapped the soils there. This image actually just shows the gets you oriented so that you can see the depth of this mass grave feature below the ground surface. So the top line on the profile view represents the modern surface, and then you'll see that lower line represents the base of our excavation, where we terminated excavation. And then below that, you'll see where we have projected, based on our awareness of the depth at which we encountered burial number 1, in addition to information from our cores, we estimate that the base of the mass burial trench floor actually hits at just above 2 meters, or roughly about 6 feet below the ground surface. But of interest is on the left-hand side, you'll note we also discovered evidence that they had the people who excavated this mass grave and buried these individuals, cut steps into the soil, presumably to facilitate easier access getting into and out of the grave shaft. This is not the type of a feature that you would otherwise expect for a situation where you're burying 1, 2, 3 individuals. It's the kind of effort that you go to when you have many more individuals that you're wanting to bury, and you're making a lot of trips in and out of that hole. And so those steps would have likely facilitated that process and made it easier for people to get in and out of it. But I think it's really interesting and telling. You can see that open space there, kind of by number 11, like the 11-meter mark on the plan view. So there's like an open space there just to the left of coffin number 11, burial number 11. And we think that's in part because as we excavate deeper, we may encounter yet another step down into that. So that's where you'll see that additional dotted line there to kind of project where we think that might be. But again, that's going to be subject to further, through confirmation through further excavations. And I think that might be my last slide, Amy, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phoebe.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So I wanted to be available to address any questions that might arise about the skeletal analysis, and I wanted to start with some background information on why we might be seeing the feature we're seeing there in Trench A, the steps, and here's a little bit of historical information. I do recommend, if you have access to getting your own download of this clip of this newspaper, because it doesn't show up well to get the whole story on the slide, but basically it says the bodies of 18 Negroes killed in the rioting Tuesday night and Wednesday morning are awaiting burial at 2 local undertaking establishments until somebody can be found to dig the graves. And remember, in this time period, most blacks, if they hadn't fled, they were in the internment camps. And you'll see that the date of this clip is June 2nd, 1921. And the two funeral homes, McCune and Mowbray, were storing 18 individuals in the summer in boxes, but storing them. And you'll see further down here, it says that McCune had moved theirs into the garage because they were worried about sanitation. And they were in the process this is on the morning of June 2nd, of making an appeal to in the city officials to have the graves dug in the Potter's Field in the city cemetery. So we knew the Potter's Field was of interest, but we didn't have an idea where. And those of you who've been on site may have seen the amount of square footage we've been dealing with the black part of the Potter's Field alone. So from our investigations 20 years ago, we had been thinking these would be individual burials based on that the funeral records indicated burial numbers, but seeing this newspaper account here is not direct evidence, but it is incentive for burying these bodies in a mass grave, because some of them have already been dead probably a full day, more than 24 hours, and in the summer heat, and decomposition occurs in real time, and sanitation, yes, would have been a problem. Just to remind you of our deceit. Oh wait, next slide, please. I tried to advance the slide. Next slide, please. This table is generated from death certificate data that our colleague Betsy Warner put together. It has the number there is just the count. It's not a number, the grave number associated with the death record. The receipts from the funeral homes. It's just the count of individuals that we have documented buried in Oaklawn. 13 of them in the Potter's Field for sure. The other 5 we assume were also buried there from the Mowbray funeral home. So I put this list together in part to show you 2 issues that in our further investigations will come into play in helping us confirm whether the decedents we expose are related to the race massacre. Notice that the causes of death noted for these documented individuals are gunshot wounds for the majority. So, and as these were not autopsied individuals, the probability of still having projectiles internally, or certainly if there was skeletal damage, displaying skeletal damage, is a feature that I will be looking for in the skeletal analysis, even though we will have issues with preservation. The individuals with thermal damage, if they only suffered thermal damage without any other trauma, it may be difficult with the kind of preservation we're dealing with to perceive that. But note that we're looking for a large number of individuals with gunshot wounds, mostly with gunshot wounds, and that feature, having multiple individuals demonstrate a similar kind of violence, will be and being male, because you see here that these are male victims. A preponderance of maleness and gunshot wounds will be a part of our circumstantial evidence supporting that they're Tulsa race massacre victims. The other issue that may come about as far as our excavation plan for returning is, note that Eddie Lockhart was buried on the 5th, not on the 2nd. And this may affect how we find individuals interred in this mass grave feature, because a careful excavation can often reveal issues like time of installation. So we'll see what happens if, considering that they may have been in haste to inter even the first 17 individuals, well, first 18 if you count the stillborn as well, then if they were in a hurry, Eddie Lockhart might have a different kind of interment pattern if they'd already sealed the mass grave. But they certainly had numerous individuals to bury in a hurry. And I won't go into, well, I'll try not to go into gory details, but yes, time would have been of the essence. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you in summary an idea of what the analytical steps will be. So the preservation of burial 1, the lady in burial 1, her cranial features were feminine, and her some of her long bones, the dimensions of her long bones were not robust, and so they weren't from someone who had a lot of muscle or was very large. They were consistent with a woman as well, and the quality of her skeletal remains, her largest bones, like her thigh bone, the shaft of it well preserved, but the fine bones of her skull, we did see her skull. We saw that when we uncovered it, she was peeking out at us right here out of the soil, but anything below here was so fragile that we actually got to watch her skull collapse as we cleared soil away from the edges of it so that we could find the boundaries of her casket. So fragile bones are even more fragile. As I said before, teeth are well preserved, but the bones holding those teeth are not. So we are planning steps in the analytical process to apply a preservative to the bones that will be needed for identification purposes, but that excludes the teeth. We don't apply preservatives to individual teeth, and that goes to if we want to do any destructive testing later. Teeth are commonly the areas that are chosen for destructive testing for chemical analysis. So we won't apply it to anything like any teeth, but areas that can help us determine things like the sex of the individual, how old were they at the time that they died. Those areas will apply bone preservative. And then if they're traumatic areas like gunshot wounds that can withstand, because some of the features of gunshot wound are fairly durable just as they appear in bone, but the idea is apply the preservative as a neutral substrate to hold those features together, not to obscure them or to make them more apparent. So it's a case-by-case decision, right? So, but the goal is to be able to document the features. So that's why I say to most bones, but the preservative technically is reversible, but we won't, the fragility won't allow us that luxury. And so that means not applying it to any bone that we may want later, may want to do destructive testing. We haven't, that's a decision that collectively not me talking, but you, all of us here listening, we will have a voice in. We will use metal detection. You heard about the nails in the coffins, and a lot of those nails were confirmed again with metal detection. And we expect to use that once we get the remains clear to a point where we can see how they're oriented as burials. From the historical records, we know that the 18 individuals were buried in plain boxes, and we did see a differential preservation of coffins in the trench, like in burials 2 and 3 had relatively nice coffins, at least as far as being distinct. One still had a plate, but as we went west in the trench, coffins became outlines made out of nails, and us finding skeletal material within the outline. So that sounds like a plain box to me, and another corroboration of our context. But if the remains were buried, shortly after they were recovered, and we know there weren't any physical investigations, autopsies of the remains, they should, at least to some degree, preserve in place the arrangement of their projectiles. And I say to some degree because over time, as groundwater moves through remains and as the coffins themselves are all collapsed, the relative locations change. But somewhere in the context of individual skeletons, there should hopefully, unless they're through and through bullet wounds, which do happen, preserve projectiles, or at least the scatter from lead onto bone if the projectiles hit bone. So that's where the radiography will come in if we can maintain sufficient preservation to get them radiographed. So we'll also be documenting for the features of identity, and thereafter trauma, I'm focusing on trauma associated with the cause of death. And I say that because skeletons are very interesting. You know, they hold stories. And so these individuals were already seeing features like tooth decay, you know, plaque, and how well worn teeth can be in the unknown lifetime, even a burial one, how well worn her teeth were. And yet we didn't have, you know, we weren't investigating her, so we didn't have a way of saying how old was she. We weren't looking for those elements. But those are interesting features. But if we see other trauma that was, say, before death, it may get imaged, but remember, we're looking for the story that corroborates why they're in this burial, this mass grave to begin with. So much of the focus will be on the trauma associated with the cause of death. And there could be other forms of trauma. You know, these individuals could display something other than gunshot wounds, like sharp force, you know, stabbing or chops, you know, that's a trauma. But our narrative, our historical records are aimed at gunshot wounds, but we'll see what we have, because we have to establish the context of these burials to associate them with the Tulsa Race Massacre. So I wanted to present that to you. So if you had any questions about how we were going to go forward with identifying if these burials are our people, because it's clearly a mass grave, and this is that process you've heard before, but with the addition of now we're preparing for the preservation that we're seeing. And I can add that for we only saw a few skeletal remains in Trench A, because we now knew, by then we knew what depth we could dig to without hitting, catastrophically hitting burials. And so we only exposed a few items, like a few teeth, basically a cranium. And the preservation of some of those cranial elements was comparable or a little bit better than in burial one. But they were better because the one cranium I saw, it was a robust person, you know, masculine. So more bone there to still be present. But that was one individual. So I have hope that we'll see I've worked with bone that was much less preserved, and I have much hope that these remains will provide enough detail, but it may be painstaking in that we may have to spend a lot of time in reconstruction, literally gluing as much as we can, or as closely as joins allow, gluing bones back together, and some won't reconstruct. So, but that's how we'll get our answers. So that's my. We'll go to the next slide. And this is where we will invite your questions, because our next phase, it does involve when will we come back to start the investigation, and how will we pursue, what model will we pursue to re-expose Trench A or the entire mass grave, and your sentiments on that. I can say that as models go, typically to get the full story on how an event like that mass grave could occur, we will need to expose it to its entirety. But this is our next phases, is excavate in a way that we can determine the context of all of those, well, however many all is, at least 18, but to determine the context of the burials.
And I think it would also just, I think it's probably safe to say that we are anticipating that there's actually going to be a subsequent meeting. It's probably going to be at the next meeting where we'll really kind of hone in on talking about those next phases of the plans for the next phases of the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that probably fair to say, Amy and Phoebe, I think? But for tonight, also, if anybody has questions just about the work that that just happened in October, any of the things that we presented this evening, or any questions about the summary document, we're happy to field any of that.
Darn, Amy, the last slide. Could we have the last slide first, though?
Sure. You're testing my technical abilities.
Oh dear, sorry.
No, you're good. You're
The
good.
last slide, sorry, it's a thank you. And thank
Yes.
you to the crew, the physical crew, and so the storm and sewer, the mayor's office, the mayor, Amy, Michelle, the public oversight committee, all of our observers. But I point this out because all of you who are here who are not part of one of these groups, you're part of this investigation. Your presence here and your attention supports our reversal of the suppression of this moment. So thank you as well. And thanks to our grad students that we had schlepping at our beck and call at this effort, and my colleague Heather Walsh-Haney. But thanks to all of you, and I certainly look forward, we all look forward to our next round of investigation.
So we do want to take a
Are you all
moment
open to
and
questions?
allow the Public Oversight Committee to ask clarifying questions, to make comments on the report that was distributed, and really lay the groundwork to sort of wrap up this text excavation phase. And then, as Phoebe and Carrie mentioned, we will plan then to come back together in January and discuss next steps. But first, we'll turn it over to the Public Oversight Committee. If you have questions or comments, you can either put those in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask Carrie and Phoebe directly.
I had a question. This is Regina Goodwin. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go right ahead.
Thank you. My question was, one, I know we are referring to the 18, that 18 were anticipated. Certainly, I think everybody read the same commission report. I'm trying to get an understanding. I know this has been asked. How are we saying 18 if we know when we read the original report, it talked about 18, however, 2 were embalmed and sent out of town, 2 bodies from the 18. What are your thoughts about that?
So I looked at the death certificates, and but I only looked at the death certificates for technically 19 because the stillborn as well. And those 19 documents were for individuals. It did not indicate any embalming. And so there were individuals killed, like Dr. Jackson and this guy lost his name. He was a porter at a bank. He was killed, shot on the street, and their bodies were sent to relatives. So there are individuals who were killed, and publicly so. No one, that weren't buried in Oaklawn. But I don't know of any other ones. I didn't research any other ones aside from that doctor and then the guy who worked at the bank. But there are accounts of those in the newspapers from June 2nd of the narrative of those 2 individuals and where their remains were sent to friends, but not of these 18.
Okay. And I guess it's how I was reading it. I read about the stillborn and actually a prominent doctor, right? And they talk. So I'm thinking they were thinking about AC Jackson, but Dr. Jackson. The other question, and I'll leave it for others, is the whole Clyde Eddy. How is it that we never got back to where we were 20 years ago, where we had left off and we were talking about excavating? And I've been asking this question for 2 years. And to say we did a core sample of the Clyde Eddy site, we knew about these bodies and this spot. So I'm just wondering, why did we not get to really the Clyde Eddy spot and where we left off 20 years ago?
And I can take an initial stab at that one, but what I would say is that so the geophysical survey, that work that was done some 20 years ago, and then was subsequently published, unfortunately, they did not include a datum point that would otherwise allow us to know where on the landscape they were specifically situated. And so with the more recent geophysical survey work, we've been making efforts to try and relocate, try and situate ourselves back on top of that same grid that they did, using our newer technology. But unfortunately, without having that data point, it makes it really challenging to precisely do that. We thought we had hit the mark with this latest round of the geophysical survey work, and there was an anomaly that appeared kind of consistent with one that was described by that earlier effort, and that was why we actually did target it for the coring, extraction of coring samples this time around. But unfortunately, almost all of those came back with indications of natural stratigraphy that did not have the hallmarks of what you're looking for when you are in the middle of a grave shaft. There were a couple of those core samples that did yield some amount of disturbed soil, but the size was such that it was probably a single individual, perhaps, if that was even associated with a grave shaft, but certainly not like what would be expected for what Clyde Eddy described, or what was expected from that original work some 20 years ago. We are hopeful. We are not closing out efforts to try and continue on that front. We just weren't successful this time. We're going to continue to try to expand our area of investigation. There are several open spaces, I should say, for which there are no marked graves in that overall area. So there are some other potential candidates where we can target our next steps to continue to pursue that lead, because we're very much so committed to that. I do want to do a shout out really quickly to Kevin and just say that I know that he just reached out to me today, even with some additional information that hopefully may help us be yet another clue that will help us make sure that we can try and situate those next efforts in the correct location. But we have not given up on that lead.
Are there other questions from the Public Oversight Committee?
You guys, just one follow-up. Whatever happened with looking at the map backwards, and there was an error in terms of looking at the map, and I don't know if that ever got corrected. There was discussion months and months and months ago, and I imagine we would be looking in the wrong spot if the map was inverted.
So that effort, basically trying to reorient how we were looking at that map, is what led us to the most recent area that we did the latest round of geophysical survey work out there, and that was where we were hopeful that we had actually landed on the right place, and that maybe we had actually figured out what the issue was. But we just really think that we're not quite in the right place. So we have more space that we can check out, that hopefully we will be right the next time.
Yes, I had a question. Currently, where are we with the Rolling Oaks, Old Booker T site?
I think I will take this one for the group. The City of Tulsa and the University of Oklahoma have reached out to the property owner repeatedly throughout the pandemic. Unfortunately, he is still unwilling to travel from California to Oklahoma, and the terms of our agreement say that he will be present before he will allow us access to his property. So we're still waiting for pandemic conditions to allow him to travel and then provide us access to his property. One thing that did come up in physical investigation committee discussions is just the challenges that arise when remains are located on private property. And we hope to come back to you in January and have a discussion with you all about where remains should be reinterred and how they should be memorialized. And we think that this issue of whether remains are reinterred on private versus public property, and how you maintain access and ensure good keeping of remains long term will be something we should definitely spend some time discussing in January.
So in January, we'll be talking about the reinterment, or will we also get another update on the Rolling Oaks?
We'll absolutely provide an update on Rolling Oaks again. At every meeting, we will be sure to provide you with that update on Rolling Oaks, because we're still waiting for that private property owner to provide us access, and until that's resolved, we'll keep providing you with updates.
I'd like to jump in and just add one other update. And just to clarify something, there's been a lot of talk about the original 18 and the original 18 area, the Clyde Eddy area as well too. I think it's important to remember that we're looking for, the remains of any and all massacre victims wherever they might be. So we've had a lot of focus on Oaklawn, and we've talked a lot about Rolling Oaks as well too. But I just wanted to assure you that our investigative efforts in terms of trying to learn of other possibilities have been ongoing. We've received a number of calls and emails from the public. I've been following up on those. I also wanted to give you an update on one of them in particular. I ended up contacting a gentleman by the name of Hugh McKnight. Mr. McKnight is 77 years old, retired. He spent almost his entire career with the Parks Department at the city of Tulsa. I drove back to Tulsa in November and met Mr. McKnight at New Block Park. In 1970, when Mr. McKnight was 27 years old, he was a brand new employee of the city of Tulsa's Parks Department. He had a lower level managerial role of some sort. I'm not exactly sure of the terms, but when he began work, moved to Tulsa, began work, there was an older employee on his crew by the name of Buck Mosier. And one day, Mr. Mosier pulled him aside, Mr. McKnight aside, and said, "There's something you ought to know about." And McKnight said, "Okay." And Mosier showed McKnight two areas at New Block where Mosier said that massacre victims were buried. Okay, two distinct areas. These were in areas that we had not looked before. These were areas where there was no sort of oral tradition or any oral histories to suggest that burials were there, but here they were. Mosier was 53 in 1970, so he was only 4 years old at the time of the massacre. However, he had been working for the Parks Department since 1940, at least since 1940, which is only 19 years after the massacre. So whereas this information from Mosier tonight would have originated with someone else, it's third hand, but I think that it's potentially promising information. I can tell you that Mr. McKnight told his supervisor about this in 1970, and his supervisor blew him off and said, "Well, there's no proof of this, whatever," didn't want to hear it. Our plan is certainly, in the months ahead, is to do geophysical work and to study these two sites. So I just want to let you know that oftentimes, we're kind of focused on one thing, but please know that we are open to any information about any site. I've followed up or intend to follow up on every lead that has been given to us. And please know that we're looking for massacre victims wherever they may be.
Thanks for that update, Scott. Are there other questions from the Public Oversight Committee? I'll note that we do, members of the public, media, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll get to those next.
This is Chief Amashan. After at the end of the first dig, we had our closing meeting of the day. And there was a gentleman from the city who offered support through a friend of his with the military who had technology that he was willing to allow us to utilize for this search. What became of that conversation?
So we met. So let's see, a few of us, Carrie and I, and some representatives from the city, Mark and I. We met with the gentleman. His technology, he could not. So the gentleman you're referring to, his name is Dr. Bakhtar, and I may be mispronouncing it a little bit, but okay, or just outright mispronouncing it. But anyway, the main problem is he could not clearly explain to us how his technology worked in a way where any of us could look it up. And so as a result, we were, well, suspicious of his offer, even though it was a free offer, sort of, because at the same time that he was offering to do a scan for free, he also wanted to control how the investigation, the survey, and the forensic anthropology and the archaeology occurred. He had a lot of, you ought to bring this person in as part of his offer. But since then, on a better note, we have been in touch with someone who could tell us what the technology is. And it's a type of radar that uses a lot of arrays, points a lot of sensors at the source at one time, and can can integrate multiple signals together at once to give a three-dimensional image of the site being examined, the underground area. The problem is, but yet we're in the early stages of that inquiry on how this multi-array radar actually works, but there does still appear to be a catch, because we have sent in our geophysical results currently, and you remember that we keep saying there's something about that soil of Tulsa, the clay layers that give us a depth of only 1 meter, and then some of our sites like New Block Park are rich with power lines, and the power lines interfere with the equipment. The power lines are still a problem. So even for the multi-array radar. So we're trying to figure it out, but we're really in the early stages. I haven't given up hope, but I do recognize that electrical interference is real. You know, I can't watch TV and walk my treadmill at the same time on the antenna, because the treadmill can talk to the antenna. So I get it, but I haven't given up hope, because we have someone who could tell us what the technology is, who's actually looking into it, as opposed to our prior contact where the gentleman just couldn't, for some reason, say multi-array radar. I'm being a little frank, but that was the problem.
Are there other questions from the Public Oversight Committee?
Yes, I have one more question.
Okay.
And I'm still processing the answer I just got about this equipment as it relates to the opposition to what the I mean, I'm trying to understand the opposition in a context that's palatable. Because I'm really trying to understand the stipulations that the gentleman gave, and who were the people that he was wanting to be part of his research, or the utilization of his technology. I'm trying to understand that, because I'm not thorough.
I want to add, there's Phoebe was not completely, I mean, she didn't give all of the detailed information there, but I would say too is that we have no indication that this gentleman has been successful at utilizing his technology for the purposes of identifying a mass grave or a similar type of feature.
Right.
And so, and there was, so in the one indication of a single burial that apparently it was successful with, was a known burial, marked burial with other information that they could draw from to be able to say who it was, what it was, and everything else. So it's not been to what he described to us had not been utilized in a circumstance where it had successfully been used, a technique that had been successfully used to identify an otherwise unmarked burial that was not known through any other means. And there's not been the kind of ground truthing to actually then support that anything that he's identified is associated with a burial or mass grave. A lot of the things that he's identified are things that are more military. I feel like we can't, I don't know how much we can talk about this, but there's other things the other ways in which his technique has been utilized apparently to good success for other purposes, but not really like this.
Yeah, like large size objects, but not. I did ask him if he'd ever been able to find a single forensic burial, and he said no, nothing the size of an individual burial with his technique. So that was not already known.
So what is his technology used for? I mean, what has he been successful at?
Well, we're not sure because
he apparently this is.
Sorry, Carrie, you
I
go.
think we're not supposed to be talking about. I don't think, because it's military in nature, and so I don't know how much.
Okay, well, the fact that you said that makes me understand why he might be even vague. You know, like, okay, well, if we have an agreement, then I can be more transparent. You know, because if it is a military technology that he has to, you know, that he can't be so transparent about without an agreement. Like, you know, let's have this agreement, then we can express in more detail what we're capable of doing. That's what it's sounding like to me.
He was sufficiently transparent to be able to answer our questions with regard to its utility for finding human remains.
Okay.
But the other things that it has been used for that were more military in nature were things that had nothing to do with finding people, nothing to do with finding human remains, but had to do with other kinds of military activities or Defense Department activities that had nothing to do with anything like what we're doing. And there were just, yeah, so it's certainly something. I mean, we definitely entertained it. We listened to him and what he had to say. He could not produce documentation of his work. He provided us, you know, with very limited information that we could then utilize for the purposes of better understanding what it is he does and how he does it and so forth. But, you know, it's not something that, it's just something that we did not feel at this point in time that it was going to be useful based on the information and that we got from that meeting. And that's just, what I should say too is that there are other, there are other people who can utilize that. As to Phoebe's point, there are other individuals who have come forward that we are still in conversation with, who have indicated an ability to utilize the similar types of technology, not precisely the same as his, but similar types of technology, who have in fact been successful at working on forensic cases and identifying individuals, have worked in these kinds of circumstances and were completely forthright in talking with us about their methods. And that to us is perhaps, that's something that, you know, we're still looking into that type of a situation, but those are very recent conversations that have taken place. But that's just basically just to let you know that we're not intentionally ignoring other potential avenues of investigation, but we need to vet these potential offers to assess the extent to which they actually will yield or be appropriate for this particular investigation.
So the other resources that you're in talks with, what are the odds? I mean, because I'm assuming at this point you're not. I mean, you're only entertaining entities that are vetted. So what are the odds that we're going to utilize those that you're in conversation with?
That's a hard question to answer right now, only because like I said, those are very recent conversations that have happened, and those are ongoing. But it's entirely possible that those are avenues that we would potentially pursue.
Okay. So my other question was, what is going to happen with the remains? I mean, not the remains, the findings from the first dig, because I was curious about. I looked at the photos of all the items that we found, but I didn't see the coin that I found.
Oh, you mean the penny? I assume it's in there, but I haven't seen any of the. Oh, well, I'll let Carrie speak to that because I think it's all stored.
But there were some, to the extent that it was possible to do so, and actually so Phoebe, with regard, there were some materials that have been retained, and those are being stored on site. But then others were actually reinterred, as I recall, Phoebe, where we put them in boxes and put them back. So some of the artifacts actually were put back in boxes and put back with the individuals with whom they had been originally found.
Oh, well, he's referring to the Sexton area,
okay. I'm sorry. I thought we were talking. Okay, so the Sexton area.
Not the stuff we left there.
Okay. So yeah, those artifacts those have been analyzed. That's information that's getting ready to be put. That the information from the finished analysis is all going to be part of the final technical report, and the photographs have been completed. And so those are, as I am aware, those are prepped and ready they can be taken to that next phase for curation wherever that next facility might be. So that's a deliberation that has not yet happened. And I think that's something that perhaps we can add that to January's agenda as far as talking about that. But they're ready. They are at that point where, as I understand, they're ready to take that next step for curation.
Have you all been able to determine from what you've exhumed thus far, from the actual bodies, any cause of death?
No, we haven't actually exhumed anyone yet. That's part of our part of the next step is to get the legal permission to exhume the remains, because it will take quite a bit of reconstruction and time and preservation to actually analyze the remains enough for cause of death. So that'll be next year, assuming we get the exhumation notice level of permission from the state. But that's what we're actually in the progress of. We're literally, Amy's working with the public health and the district attorney to get well, we have two different levels of exhumation. So we're trying for a level that lets us produce a report that we all of us have access to. Because a public analysis is feasible with an exhumation order, but if they're different levels of legality to pursue, and I don't want to pursue the one where everything is sealed.
And when you say district attorney, is his office going to be a part of that exhumation process to search for criminal activity?
In terms of how to set which level of exhumation order we get, because there's an exhumation permit and then there's an exhumation notice, and the notice, they vary in where the remains end up after you exhume them, and the involvement of the district attorney's office varies depending on which one of those we end up with. So if I remember correctly from the explanation, but the district attorney's office might just be there to assist us in getting the right language to a judge. But we need some kind of level of exhumation, either a notice of exhumation, which means we disinter the remains, analyze them in the cemetery, and put them back in the cemetery, or we need an exhumation permit, which means we exhume the remains, analyze them, and reinter them somewhere else. but that whole process of which permit requires the assistance of public health, the mayor's office, the district attorney's office, everyone talking, and that's just to get either one. And then thereafter, will inform our conversation about how much analysis we can conduct and where the remains are reinterred.
Well, it seems to me
Requires a
that
whole
it's
Did you have another question?
I think we were having some feedback. Hold on, let's try. Can I try again?
Hello?
yeah. So January's agenda was about possible discussion about internment and all of those things. That seems premature to me, considering we haven't been able to. I mean, we haven't gone through the process of actually identifying yet, and just for verification purposes, verifying who we're dealing with.
But we can't dig anyone up without having a reinterment plan. We can't lift them out of the earth without actually having a plan for what will happen to them. They can't just be raised and be left on a shelf somewhere. We have to actually have the plan.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
So, Ms. Phoebe, in talking about the exhumation permits or notice, are we looking at one more than the other as far as a permit or notice?
Well, yes, the notice would let us be active more quickly because that would mean our interment plan would just be to put them back in Oaklawn, and those are plans that are easier to, well, in my mind, I'm not a judge, but I find that an easier plan to approve. If I were setting a city as representative, as the next of kin, essentially for unknown individuals, I would find it easier to approve an action that basically does not move remains off-site. But we have to have time to meet about it because the reinterment process is affected by if we do DNA analysis of the remains. And that we need a conversation, all of us need to have a conversation about what it will mean to get DNA results. Because if we have a strategy, if we have a reinterment plan that is to reinter off-site, well, and then we find relatives, well, the relatives may end up with a say. They may not. It's complicated because there's a next of kin hierarchy, but we have to have a strategy for that. And the simplest strategy is just to say we're not taking them off site, and that would be the notice. But
Okay.
something we all should just, in a time when the clock's not already past due, sit down and talk about this collectively, because there's a lot at stake with DNA or not, and so people need to give their opinion about that.
And what is that the DNA process, if you will?
So, nutshell, it would be take some of the better preserved elements from the individuals, so like their teeth, really, and sample them for DNA markers that might relate them to people in public databases, the public DNA databases, like any of you who are in Ancestry or 23andMe, like I'm 23andMe and my sister's Ancestry. So those are public databases to some degree. Well, when I entered, it was public. So the DNA from 1921 will get compared to people who have their DNA today, from 2000 or whenever this became popular. And there's about 3 generations in between there. So we'll get probably cousins of the 1921 people, but we won't know which cousin or cousins, or several last names, like 5. We can look at the cousin chart, but there'll be multiple relatives living today to compare to a 1921 person. And that means the first round of DNA will just give us targets to contact to ask for their DNA to try and narrow down the cousin relationships. And I mean, the luckiest we could get is to find a great-grandchild, probably great-grandchild. and that would be a best case. And it could happen, but people have to just incidentally already be in the database, and that's assuming there's good enough preservation from usually the teeth to yield the DNA in the first place. So it's a destructive process. Once we submit the teeth, we won't get them back. And if we find that we have individuals who say aren't related to one of our named individuals, but are interred there, we can't move them. You know, if we find that, you know, like Fred Smith is buried there, we found his cousins, and we don't have a Fred Smith, he has to stay there in Oaklawn. So if we've made an interment plan that says everyone we dig up gets reinterred in Oaklawn, we're fine. But if our interment plan has everyone going off-site, then Fred Smith will be fine in theory, but, you know, April Smith, who's a different Smith, who it turns out to have a great-granddaughter or something, her great-granddaughter gets possession of her remains probably, and we need to allow for that. And if we weren't taking them off-site, we wouldn't have that problem of having to allow for families holding on to the remains of their loved ones, especially if it's multiple families, multiple cousins. What if they all want to say, we're not going to split up the remains, but we will have to contact them all. So it's complicated. That's why I want to save that for January, because
For
it's
sure. Okay, thank you.
I did want to follow up just super quickly on the question that Chief posed. It occurred to me that there are some of the materials that ended up at the gill crease are the full analysis has not yet been completed, and that's specifically the shoes. And then they also have the compact there that was found in the Sexton area. And just, I think mainly just due to COVID and kind of some of the circumstances there around trying to get access to get into the facility. But we do actually have a person who is willing to examine those shoes to identify them, but that analysis has not yet been completed. So that is one outstanding component that's not yet done with the artifacts that were recovered during the July excavations.
So just to recap quickly, we've committed at our January meeting to providing an update on the geophysical survey effort at Booker T. Washington / Rolling Oak Cemetery. We've also committed to further discussing this issue of whether remains should be reinterred at Oaklawn Cemetery or somewhere else, because that decision will inform the court order that we seek. That will allow us to proceed with the exhumation. Are there other questions from the Public Oversight Committee?
I had one question, you guys. I just wanted to revisit comments that were made earlier. Amy, this is Regina. Can I do that?
Sure, go right ahead.
Thanks. I was looking at, you all talked about some of the equipment that was used here in 2020 as opposed to what was used some close 20 years ago. And it's from everything that I'm reading, you all, I don't see what new that we've uncovered that wasn't documented 100 years ago. And not only to the degree of those folks that went in some 20 years ago with equipment that clearly was good enough for you all to use, because you went directly to the spot to talk about these 18 folks, which is still, I think, we can have that discussion in terms of the 16, the 18. I think if we look at the same place where we're reading, I think we'd have a better understanding, I would hope. My question is this: if you're already uncovering something that was documented 100 years ago, and it tells 100 years ago who those folks were and who they were identified as, how is it that I, as a layperson, will know that there would be a stillborn found in that area? I think you guys are referring to that. And can you all speak to that? Did you all say that the possibility of a stillborn being found there? Did somebody mention that?
Mm-hmm. So yes, the listing from the newspapers for June 2nd indicate that the mortuary deaths they had were 18 adults, adult males and then 1 stillborn. And with the same, the stillborn and 17 of the adult males have a June 2nd burial date. And the location for the adults is the Oaklawn Potter's Field. So I do note that the inference for the stillborn and the other 3, it's 15 plus 3 individuals, is that they're all buried in that same burial because there was difficulty in getting them buried in the first by June 2nd. So, but I don't know that we'll be able to perceive the stillborn individual, that infant. I don't know judging the quality of based on the preservation of the skeletal material that we're seeing for adults, an infant burial won't preserve.
I would say, but just to caveat that though, if that individual, if the infant was placed inside a coffin, it is possible that we would be able to see the signature of a smaller coffin that might be associated with the stillborn. But that's only if it was placed in, if that that individual is placed within the
Lucky
coffin.
to see those skeletal elements
Yeah,
because
the skeletal elements no, but it would mainly just be about the coffin. The coffin size could be a potential indicator because you would not expect it to be the same size as an adult.
Well, no. I just hope they would have used one.
Mm-hmm. I would also, though, add, and one thing I think that would be potentially of interest here is that even though, this talk of the original 18 is something that drew us to this particular portion of the cemetery, but if our estimations are accurate, and if this mass grave actually includes more than 18 individuals, then presumably these are going to be folks for whom we don't have that kind of documentation. And what we discover through this investigation may be the only kind of information that we are able to glean about those individuals, and if they are victims. That's just something else to consider.
I'd like to add that when I was on the ground during the last dig, based on that diagram that was drawn out, we do have, well, from my perspective or my perception, I think we do have enough evidence to show that there is a small coffin there that could potentially contain the remains of a stillborn, based on that diagram that was drawn out. So when we're drawing out the diagram to show those different boxes and those different coffins that were in that trench, so I think there's enough from that topographical view to show that evidence is there. And I think where this number issue comes up is, if you look at the Race Riot Commission report, it specifically says that 16 were buried in Oaklawn by a particular funeral home, and another funeral home took possession of 5 other coffins. So I think that's what we're talking about here when we're dealing with the numbers. If we should find more than 16, that's great. But I'm just saying, for the sake of trying to understand where the language is between 8, because if you look at the report, it starts out with 21 coffins, and then it talks about the ones that were taken out of town and the ones that were dealt with in a different manner, the ones that were embalmed, the ones that weren't. It's very detailed. So that's why this number of 16 versus 18 comes up, because it directly says that Oaklawn, that I think it was McCune Funeral Home, that they buried 16 inside of Oaklawn Cemetery. So I think that's where that conversation is arising.
The only other part I think we should add to the January update too, also speaking from Chief's question earlier, is update about the multi-array radars. We might know something from the other contact, the company that actually uses it. We might know something by them. I don't know with the holiday and COVID, but I'll keep making inquiries.
Okay, I've added that to our notes.
This is Christy. I have a question. As we're talking about new equipment, I know that Dr. Hybert from the National Geographic also mentioned you state of the art equipment that he could offer in funding as well. And I wanted to know, why has that not been a part of this investigation so far?
Well,
I think it's something that it's probably safe to say that that's been part of, we've had discussions, I've had conversations about it. Those offers, that offer was coming right at the same time that we were implementing our mobilization for the October field work. So we have simply not, honestly, just trying to digest everything that happened there. We've not had the opportunity to come back together as a team to entertain those engagements of some of those these other offers, right, like that. And so I would just simply say that it's not because, you know, it's not off the plate or anything like that. It's just simply that we have not yet come together as a team to fully vet that and discuss that, and how to best incorporate that within the team and as part of this effort. Yeah, so I think that's probably, I think, Phoebe, do you think that's the fair statement there? I mean, it's something that.
I mean, it is very correct, because a lot of the timing was right, always his contact, Dr. Heber's contacts have frequently been right on the moment when we're getting ready to go into the field. But when I've spoken to him, a lot of his interest is for a later stage of our investigation, the DNA phase, and we're not quite there yet. You know, we really do need to disinter them first. So I don't know, Christy, if he's explained, you know, described a different phase of offer, but in my conversations with him, it's been about the DNA phase of analysis, not the archaeological phase. So yeah, no, we haven't written any of his offers off the table from my perspective, because we're talking about post exhumation, and we really have to tackle this exhumation phase, the legalities of that before we do anything else.
Okay,
especially
yeah,
I'm sorry.
that's good to know that it's not off the table, and I would just would love for that to stay on the table, especially as it relates to funding and whatnot. And then just one more question, because I really don't understand, how can the owner of Rolling Oats decline us, searching for bodies there, and considering that this is a crime scene investigation. I don't understand why we can't just do it. If y'all could just help me understand that.
So there are two ways to approach this investigation. Well, actually 2.5. So we're in the halfway, and by that I mean we're performing a forensic exam, meaning we're using the techniques of forensic science. But if we start from the context of forensic analysis, forensic science, meaning the medical examiner does the exam, the Oklahoma medical examiner, if he does this exam, then we will not, and I don't mean I mean everyone, we will not get to see the outcome of the results. There won't be any more transparency. There'll be an analysis, but there won't be any of this public involvement, because it becomes a medical legal investigation. So that the forensic part still applies, in that we're going to do a death analysis, an analysis of cause of death. So instead of digging up the remains and looking at how old were they and what kind of diet they had, and how tall were they and how many children they had, that's a standard osteological exam. Instead of looking at that, we're going to look at cause of death and what features indicated how they died. And that's the forensic part, in detail, and how closely it matches our modern ways of dying through trauma. That's the forensic part. Instead of just featuring what skeletal features say who this person was. We're including how did they die. But the other part of the problem, then the reason why the medical examiner has not taken control, or one of the reasons, I'm speaking for him and he's not here, but part of the incentive for him not taking over this investigation formally is that 100 years have nearly passed, and the likelihood of having people to charge is low, very low, and the space to accommodate even 18 skeletons doesn't exist in the context of recent skeletons with, tissue still on them. So, okay, so long story short, all that to say is, if we wanted a legal process to get us into Rolling Oaks, that would mean we need to get a search warrant. That's the forensic part of the legal process. So it's the same way we control our backyards and our houses and the trunks of our cars. The police, in theory anyway, the police need to bring us a search warrant before they start digging through our property. So we would need a search warrant. But we can't make the warrant. We need a judge to make the warrant. So a judge has to look at our claim that there is a crime that was committed, and the evidence is at Rolling Oaks. Well, a judge, quite probably, but I'm not the judge, would look at our claim, and he or she would go, 100 years have passed. There are no decedents that I can charge, that we could charge, even if I grant this warrant. And you haven't told me how you're going to connect any evidence you acquire from here to any kind of investigation of live people. And in that context, there's no reason to grant a warrant that will disturb the life of the owner of the property. And so, but let's say we do go that route and we get the warrant, or no, we pursue the warrant. I don't believe we would get one. In my experience with the legal process, we will not get one. And what we will get is to permanently annoy the landowner in a way where we won't even be able to search in a friendly way. But think of it not like a cemetery with the remains of victims in it. Think of it as if it were your yard, and what would you want to happen to have people come up to you and say, hey, 100 years ago, there were people buried in your yard in a crime, and we want to investigate it. And you go, yeah, okay. And it's my yard, but yes, you've asked me permission. You can go investigate it. Now think of, oh no, I just landscaped this and planted it. I don't want you disturbing my yard for an investigation 100 years old. Well, it's an investigation. I'm going to go get a court order and get a search warrant and see if a judge will grant it. The judge didn't grant it, but you still annoyed me to the point where now we're no longer neighbors, and I would not even in a friendly way let you in. That is what is at stake, because right now we have a friendly way in.
I think one thing I'll add that maybe I hope is clarifying is, when you seek a search warrant, you have to have an official who makes an oath before a judge, and they have to give probable cause. They have to specifically state where they're looking, and they have to describe the person to be seized. And in our case, we have some hearsay evidence, but that's a really high burden that we can't meet at present. We don't know exactly who we're looking for, and we don't know exactly where they are. And so to meet that Fourth Amendment, requirement, we're just really not there. And at this point, the private property owner has said he will allow the University of Oklahoma to do the search. We just have to wait until he will be present, and then the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey can proceed with that work.
This is very reminiscent of the Brown versus Board of Education, a decision when the Supreme Court justice voted to integrate schools, but with all due deliberate speed. And it ended up taking, in most places, 16 years. Brown happened in 1954, and the schools didn't really get integrated until 1970. This is really preposterous that we now hope the attendees on this call see why justice for Black people from crimes, high crimes, such as massacres, are hardly ever investigated because of procedures and because of people such as the owner of Rolling Oaks. He can say all he wants to say. I can't hear what you say because I'm so busy seeing what you do. And he has, from the very beginning, we talked about this possible warrant. And the mayor mentioned at one of the meetings, we could go the legal route, but that'll take a long time. I doubt it would take as long as this. And with all due respect to everybody on this call, none of us are a judge. And so we can't speak for what a judge would say. We can speak from our personal experience, but I believe that we have to allow everything to happen on its own. I'm from Alabama, and Shuttlesworth, Reverend Shuttlesworth, who Shuttlesworth Birmingham Airport is named for, was trying to get a permit to march, and the judge said, "Over my dead body," and before he could hit the gavel, he died. And the next judge came in and permitted them to march. So you never know what could happen, depending on who the judge is. I don't think it's our responsibility to say what a judge would do. It's our responsibility to seek bodies and find them and examine them wherever they are. And I hope that's what our goal is. And to say that nobody is no physical person here, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of entities that are still here that were present in Tulsa in 1921. Now, those entities probably don't want to admit culpability. That's a whole nother argument. But to say nobody is here or hardly anybody is here is not true. And so I think, as I've stated in several meetings beforehand, we are allowing this individual to hold up a criminal investigation. The worst crime in this city's history is being held up by one white man. And white men actually did the race massacre in 1921. And now they are impeding, one in particular, the process or progress of finally getting all the bodies we need.
Miss Brenda, I'm just noting that we're more than 30 minutes past our allotted time, and I didn't know if you had any parting words or wanted to help us close out this evening. Just to go over that list one more time, in January we will have our Booker T. Rolling Oaks update. We will discuss plans for reinterment that will inform our court order to proceed with the exhumation at Oaklawn of the original 18 site. And we will hopefully also have an update about the multi-array radar that Phoebe spoke about.
Yes, we want to thank everyone for attending tonight's meeting, especially to our physical investigative team for your overview of the work that has been done so far. Also to our Oversight Committee for your questions, and to the public for the questions that they have. We look forward to our January meeting to further discussions as have been outlined just now by Ms. Amy. And I'd also like to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye, everyone.